Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. This podcast episode is sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab at the University of Hong Kong. How's it going, Richard?
Good, going very well, Justin. So, I know that you're in Hong Kong and you're spending a lot of time there. And as listeners know, I also lived in Hong Kong for about 3 years. And, Hong Kong is known as a very international city. And another thing it's kind of known for is as a kind of a food destination. A lot of people find
Yes.
there to be this kind of great mixture of the East and the West and the modern and the classic kind of fused together. And
Yeah.
Hong Kong, another thing is it's so cramped that a lot of people don't have big kitchens. So it seems like that leads to a lot of people eating out quite frequently. And there's a lot of restaurants. So Justin, I was going to ask you about the food scene and what you do. Do you actually try to cook or do you find yourself being out a lot? And what do you like over there? And how do you find the food culture?
Yeah, Hong Kongers take some pride in Hong Kong food, the seafood, the dim sum. I
Mhm.
hear it's quite good, but I myself am kind of an eccentric eater. Yeah, what you said about the food culture is all correct because people have become accustomed to living in small spaces over the decades. Also because at least until relatively recently in history, people didn't have the benefit of air conditioning, so they, really looked forward to getting out in the evening when it was cooler. There's just been a sort of long-standing culture of going out to eat and it tends to be rather late at night. So I'm eccentric because A, I'm a morning person. I get up very early. That means I have dinner early so that I can go to bed early. And B, I'm a vegetarian. So I don't get
Mhm.
to avail myself of all the wonderful foods that Hong Kong has to offer. I eat out many times a week. When I'm on campus, I regularly eat at this vegetarian place not far from my office called Bijos, this Buddhist vegetarian restaurant.
Mhm.
So I really admire and appreciate the Hong Kong food scene, even as a vegetarian. And that's because there are quite a few truly vegetarian restaurants where they offer these like pseudo meats and everything. And then it's just so international that the restaurants that I've learned to count on over the years
Mhm.
are all here. Indian food, Thai
Mhm.
food, I can always find vegetarian options there.
Mhm.
So when I'm out late at night, which, happens sometimes, I can see that people are really enjoying themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, I do miss the dim sum. We used to love that. That was really a great experience because, you sit around and you chat over tea and, the dim sum was very good in Hong Kong. The other thing I remember we would often eat at the canteen. So I would imagine
Yeah.
Hong Kong University also has a canteen. I wonder if you ever eat there because the food prices are really good. And I remember for breakfast, we would often get the congee. And I guess you can eat congee
Yes.
because
Yes.
there's
Uh-huh.
vegetarian versions. They don't always have meat in there. Yeah, I do miss the congee for breakfast that I would often get in Hong Kong, which is a kind of congee is like a rice porridge, right?
Yes.
And it tastes slightly kind of like a risotto in a way too, because it's made of
Yeah.
rice and it's
But it's more watery. Yeah. It's a
yeah, it's a little
soupy.
more brothy, soupy. That's right. I remember that was a nice quick breakfast. And also, I guess, yeah, I could totally see that there's a lot of vegetarian options. Like Indian vegetarian to me is some of maybe the best kind of
Yes.
vegetarian kind of cuisine. It's just so good. And
Yeah. When I
um,
want to treat myself, that's what I do. So, yes, I do consider myself someone who celebrates the culture in part by celebrating the food. And I regret that I'm not able to relish, savor the food as much as the people who can actually enjoy the meat. But speaking of all this, I wanted to say, actually, this is all quite relevant to the topic that we're going to discuss today, because the topic is basically a continuation of what we discussed last time. Last time we
mhm,
discussed the moral sprouts, sort of the origins of virtue in Mencius. This time we're talking about moral development, the cultivation or development of ethical virtues. And we're going to do that in conjunction with passage 1A7 of the Mengzi of Mencius.
mhm,
And some people actually read this passage as a plea for vegetarianism.
mm,
And that's not quite right in my view, but I can see why they're tempted by that view. Because the story essentially of a king who decides that this ox that's being taken to the slaughter, essentially for ritual purposes, for a ritual sacrifice, he decides to spare it out of sympathy for it. And Mengzi thinks that's the right thing for him to do. He thinks that's a sign that he has budding virtues, that virtues, that are developing in him. And he even concludes with this sort of famous line. I think it's a relatively famous line, 君子远庖厨, which means something like the gentleman stays far from the kitchen, or he keeps the kitchen far from himself, meaning that the gentleman needs to maintain a certain sort of softness or compassion, even for animals,
Mhm.
such that he or she, seems like Mencius is thinking mostly of, male gentlemen, but it's not entirely clear, must not expose themselves to a lot of animal suffering and that kind of thing.
Because or else will be hardened. And so your emotional sensitivities for the suffering of animals will be diminished. And so you won't be able to maintain the true heart of a gentleman or sometimes exemplary person, right? The Junzi. Yeah. So some do
Right.
argue that that shows that, oh, Mengzi thinks you should stay away from the kitchen. Although I don't know if that implies that you should be a vegetarian. I mean, strictly logically speaking, it doesn't. But I could see
Yes.
why one might make a case for it based on that.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that, in fact, Mencius is not suggesting that we should spare oxen from these ritual sacrifices. He thinks they need to go on, that they're important rituals. And I certainly don't think he believes that human beings in general should go without meat. I think he sees meat as both something that is a necessary part of the human diet and it warrants a certain amount of animal suffering. It's pretty clear that Mencius thinks you shouldn't inflict unnecessary or excessive suffering on animals, but he thinks that we are allowed to be partial to our own species and
Mhm.
be more concerned to pursue human interests at the expense of animals. So, insofar as he does seem to recommend that some people stay far from the kitchen and not get involved in the messy, callous business of killing animals and preparing them for food, it seems like it's basically a kind of classist observation that people who we would expect to, I don't know, make decisions should cultivate certain sensitivities, certain virtues that are dependent, like compassion or benevolence, that are based on sensitivities. And in order to do that, they shouldn't be the kind of people who are going out and, cutting the throats of animals or making them suffer, kind of brutally
Mhm.
killing them and that kind of thing.
Interestingly, of
So,
course, we talked about the butcher passage in the Zhuangzi. And of course,
yes,
Zhuangzi thinks, nope, you could still be a butcher, it seems, and be a sage and truly follow the Tao. So
yes,
that's quite
exactly.
interesting.
So that's actually going to come up in today's discussion. Richard and I are recording this intro after the discussion, and that's because we didn't want to keep our guest for too long. And our guest is Brian Van Norden, the very person who has been translating passages from the Mengzi, from the Mencius that we've sometimes discussed. Really great scholar of Chinese philosophy in general, and Mencius
Mhm.
in particular.
And so we are absolutely delighted to have had Brian because he's such an expert and such an important contemporary scholar of classical Chinese philosophy. The conversation was great, and I think the audience will enjoy it as well.
And you will meet him after the intermission music. We'll be right back. All right, so to discuss today's topic, which is Mencius's account of moral development, moral cultivation, reflection, and extension, we brought in a very special guest, and we were quite pleased to have him. It's Professor Brian Van Norden, currently the James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College and Chair Professor of Philosophy at Wuhan University, which has a really great school of philosophy. I think one thing we can safely say is that Brian is one of the world's leading scholars of Chinese philosophy. He's published numerous influential books and articles, not just on Chinese philosophy, but on kind of global and comparative philosophy more generally, and even on classical Chinese. He is the translator of an authoritative translation, the authoritative translation of the Mencius or Mengzi, called Mengzi with selections from traditional commentaries, which I still use as my standard reference and in all of my teaching. And he's also done quite a bit of excellent work in public philosophy, introducing people to the ideas of classical Chinese thought. The ability to introduce to a broader audience these old texts is a very rare and valuable skill, and I really cherish Brian's contributions in this area. So I felt like since I actually know Brian personally, I should add a little bit of personal anecdote. And I've known Brian for a while now, simply because we both had the same teacher. We both had PJ Ivanhoe as a teacher, so we had been in communication even before we met in person over email. Just, in the course of trying to exchange work or fill in some gaps and questions and bibliographies and that kind of thing. But I got to know him especially well when we worked together on Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy, which is an anthology of post-classical Chinese philosophical texts, Han Dynasty and afterwards. That was quite a joy for me, Brian, and I learned a lot by editing and co-translating with you. Now, I want to recall how exactly you approached me when we decided to work on this anthology, and we'll see if you remember it the same way. So what I remember is that you wrote me to ask me about perhaps collaborating on a project and asked to talk on the phone. So we set up a time and I called you. And you then explained that you were doing this sequel to Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy, which I thought was very exciting because I was interested in post-classical philosophy and I envied the success of the first anthology that you had done with PJ Ivanhoe. But then you said, maybe this isn't fair, but this is how I remember it, Brian, that you had been sort of unstinting in your criticism of others in the field. So you were a little worried that you didn't have the right bridges and connections to other people, and you needed someone who was a little bit nicer. Maybe you could say softer, a bit more of a softie, to reach out to some of the other scholars who could potentially contribute to this anthology. So I thought, well, that's flattering. But it also implies correctly, by the way, that I'm not quite the blunt critic that you are. Anyway, that's how I recall it. But I do also recall it as a very effective collaboration. There were times when we needed to put our collective foot down and just insist, and you made us do that. But then I, of course, applied my soft touch, as it were. And I think we managed to get a pretty good group of translators involved in that project.
Yeah, no, I'm very proud of the way Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy turned out. And I don't remember the specific details of the phone call, but that sounds exactly like the kind of thing I would say. And I also found it great working with you and, your insight both into the classical Chinese language and the philosophical issues involved has, always impressed me very much. But it was fun working together. And I think we, at certain points, agreed that we would use the bear in the back room strategy.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, where you're the good cop.
Yeah.
Like, you know what Brian's like. Come on, I don't care if he's 5 months late. It doesn't matter to me, but Brian's being really difficult about it.
Right. Yeah.
So you would take some pressure off me if you would get this done.
Yes. I think that's exactly the phrase we use, bear in the back room. And you're right, that I'm much more comfortable pressuring people by saying it's really someone else losing patience with them. Yeah. Shifting blame or responsibility off on someone else.
I think I'd also just quickly note, though, that despite whatever cantankerous reputation Brian has, he's also incredibly generous. And he's been just very gracious and so helpful. And I remember when I had maybe it was my second kid, Brian emailed me and offered oh, if you want to talk about anything. He was very generous in offering his help in that way. And I think he was also gave the best comments for this paper, a manuscript I submitted to, I think it was History of Philosophy Quarterly. He gave a 6-page written extensive comments that really helped strengthen that paper. So I really appreciate it. And also I use, of course, a lot of his work, especially this more recent book, Classical Chinese for Everyone. And so that's been kind of a success. I use that in my honors class for students who have no background. Although I must admit, even there, it's tough. You realize just how difficult classical Chinese is. It's not you just kind of sit around and just kind of just soak it all in right away. It takes quite a bit of effort, actually, even at that introductory level. But it is a really amazing book. So thank you for writing that again.
Well, thank you so much again. You've both been more than generous. I doubt I can live up to the, effusive praise you've given me, but I'll try my best.
Well, so you've clearly been very productive, Brian. And that reminds me to ask you, of the many things that you've done in recent years, I assume that some of them are ongoing projects and you probably have some new ones as well. What are you up to right now?
Well, right now I'm in Wuhan in China. As you pointed out, I've got a chair professorship here at Wuhan University, and this is the first time I've been able to visit Wuhan since COVID.
Oh,
So I'm giving a lecture series here at Wuhan University. And later in the summer, there's going to be a conference on Aristotelianism and Confucianism,
oh, good.
hosted by a bunch of different institutions, including the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is run by our mutual friend, Jeff Sachs. And so that's going to be a great opportunity from scholars from all over the world to meet and talk about the interesting similarities and differences between Aristotelian and Confucian thought. And then sadly, when I return to Vassar, I'm going to be taking up the position of department chair. And
Condolences.
yeah, thank you. It's funny because I have a feeling that insofar as people outside of academia have any opinion about being a chair, and maybe they don't at all, but I think sometimes they do, and they think, oh, I bet that's a really powerful position. People must really want to be chair. And we academics know nobody wants to be chair. It's the worst.
Yeah, yeah. At least in the United States. Actually, my spouse, Melanie, when we watch, occasionally we'll go see a kind of mainstream Hollywood movie together that's about life in academia. And they often depict chairs as engaging in almost evil, conniving machinations in order to get the department chair position and to, get themselves hired into it or appointed to it, as though it's something that they all aspire to do. And my spouse says, oh my God, they're so clueless. They don't realize that academics just want to be left alone to do their work.
I know it's crazy. It really kind of is like, and as I recall in Plato's Republic, he said the philosopher kings and queens really don't want to go back into the cave to
Right.
become actual leaders.
They need to be compelled. Like they need to be forced.
Yes.
Just like being a chair.
And so there actually is an element of truth in that. But unfortunately, people like Justin is good administrator, so he gets called to do this kind of stuff sometimes.
Oh.
And I've run out of excuses for not being chair. So that's how I stumbled back into that job.
Yeah, I really don't love it. But my view is that senior scholars, the ones who have the good fortune of having tenure and good job security and such, it's their duty to do their fair share of that kind of managerial or administrative work.
Absolutely, yeah.
So speaking of management, we're going to look at the sort of featured passage that we're going to discuss today is 1A7 of the Mengzi or the Mencius. Just to remind some of our listeners who may not know, there are multiple ways of pronouncing Mengzi, sort of referring to the philosopher Mengzi or Mencius. One of them is to refer to him as Mencius. The other one is Mengzi. Mengzi tracks with the modern Mandarin pronunciation of the Chinese characters that have long been the ones that refer to him. And Brian, his translation refers to this philosopher as Mengzi. So we're probably in the habit of referring to him as Mengzi, but we'll probably switch back and forth quite liberally between the two ways of Romanizing his name. So the passage itself is 1A7, and sometimes I just in my mind call it the King and the Ox passage or King Shan and the Ox. Let me sort of set the stage a little bit. And first of all, by pointing to the philosophical theme that will be our primary focus, and then by telling you a little bit about the dramatic setting, the dramatic features of the story. So the theme that we're going to focus on is moral cultivation in two particular aspects or parts of moral cultivation as Mengzi understands it: reflection and extension. Reflection is a sort of standard translation of si, this term that sometimes is just understood to mean thinking, sometimes is meant to refer to something more emotional. Sometimes it's translated as concentration, and that's a perfectly legitimate way to translate si in some contexts. Extension is a translation actually of quite a few different terms that appear in the classical Chinese text. But among the later Confucian philosophers, commentators that I work on, the post-classical ones, the Neo-Confucians, the sort of key term that came to stand for extension more broadly was tui, tui li to tui, this tui that sometimes is understood to refer to reasoning or a kind of extension by way of seeing similarities or analogies between two things. And so these are taken in the later tradition, at least, to be technical terms that refer to particular parts or aspects of Mengzi's process of moral cultivation. And it's at least arguable, I think even quite defensible, to say that Mengzi already understands them as technical terms, that even in the context of the Mengzi itself, there he has a rather precise sense of what these terms are meant to be referring to. So the setting is as follows. So it's a dialogue between Mengzi and King Xuan of Qi. The king, like most rulers in the Warring States periods, is keenly interested in becoming the ruler who next unites and rules over all of what we now regard as China, the central states. And so there's something that's not going to be obvious to our listeners because they won't have the right historical context or the footnotes available. But basically, the assumption is that there are two ways of doing that, two ways of uniting China. One is the way of the hegemon, and hegemon is a translation of this Chinese character ba. Two famous hegemons in his day were the dukes Huan of Qi and Wen of Jing, and they're going to come up right in the beginning. And then the other way of uniting China is the way of the true king, or we might say king with a capital K. That's a translation of Wang. And it's just understood between Mengzi and his interlocutors that the way of the true king, that particular way of uniting the empire, involves or requires a ruler of supreme virtue who has this kind of charismatic effect, such that people voluntarily submit to him. And whereas the way of the hegemon involves, it seems in Mengzi's view, just raw military power and force, uniting the empire that way. Xunzi himself has views about different kinds of hegemons, some sort of diplomatically skilled and very reliable so that they become sort of the first among equals. But in any case, the key point is that there are two options as the king sees it. One is to be a true king and unite the empire that way. The other is to be a hegemon and through a combination of good diplomacy and military force, unite the empire that way.
Can I interrupt for a second,
Yes.
Justin?
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say just like a fun side note. Sometimes when the Chinese government is criticizing the US government, it will refer to American hegemony, but they will sometimes phrase this in terms of Ba Chuan Ju Yi. And so which is like the hegemon powerism of the United States. Is a way that they'll sometimes criticize the United States. And then a more fun aspect, I think this used to be true. I don't know if it's still true. In Chinese McDonald's, a Big Mac used to be called a hegemon burger.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, it's funny, actually. The word hegemon, right. So in the context of that kind of international political rhetoric that you were just referring to, Brian, hegemony really sounds pretty awful. It's a pretty pejorative term. It's the term that you use to imply some state is interfering in the affairs of other states by projecting its hegemonic power over others. But if you go back in history, it's there's a kind of grudging respect for hegemons. At least they're able to get the job done. And
good point.
Yeah. And you can kind of see it in this dialogue too. I mean, it seems that King Xuan of Qi is at least at the beginning pretty skeptical about his own capacity to be a true king. He doesn't think he has the stuff, the character for it. So, and he thinks, well, being a hegemon would still be great. Well, so the dialogue then proceeds. I like to give everyone a sort of glimpse of what's ahead. I don't want to, I don't see the point in surprising them in philosophy. It's good for people to know what the philosophical themes are in advance. So just to give you a sense of what's going to happen, Mengzi is going to quickly steer the conversation toward being a true king. Turns out that he's not very interested in talking about the way of the hegemon. And that then leads King Xuan of Qi to confess that he doesn't think, to sort of express his doubts that he has the capacity to be a true king. And Mengzi then proceeds to try to allay those doubts, to try to overcome those doubts by recalling an act of mercy that the king had committed recently involving sparing an ox that was about to be led to a sacrifice. And that act of mercy, he thinks, is evidence that he actually has the potential to become king. And in describing that act of mercy, he reinterprets it essentially. So as I understand this, as I read this passage, the king himself didn't quite understand that that there was some evidence of capacity for virtue in this act of mercy. He himself misunderstood his own act of mercy as something a little bit more self-interested, or he hadn't thought about it clearly. And so in reinterpreting it, Mengzi is often taken to be demonstrating this process of reflection and extension. Obviously, I think there's some room for debate about whether that's really what's going on, but in terms of how the later Confucian tradition understood it, this is usually seen as a kind of locus classicus for reflection and extension. So that's why we're paying special attention to this passage. And then I don't know if you have anything more to add before we begin, but I know Richard bravely volunteered to do the reading of this rather long passage.
I think you gave a great summary. Yeah, why don't we get into the passage?
Good.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll break it up. There's quite a bit here, and then we'll discuss. So this is, again, from 1A7 of the Mengzi, and this is, of course, Brian Van Noorden's own translation. King Xuan of Qi asked, "May I hear from you of the actions of Huan of Qi and Wen of Jin?" Mengzi replied, "The followers of Kongzi did not give accounts of the actions of Huan and Wen. Because of this, they were not passed on to later generations, and I have not heard of them. But if you insist, then may we talk about being king?" The king said, "What must one's virtue be like so that one can become king?" Mengzi said, "One cares for the people and becomes king. This is something no one can stop." The king said, "Can one such as ourselves care for the people?" Mengzi said, "You can." The king said, "How do you know that we can?" Mengzi said, "I heard your attendant, Hu He, say, while the king was sitting up in his hall, an ox was led past below. The king saw it and said, 'Where is the ox going?' Hu He replied, 'We are about to ritually anoint a bell with its blood.' The king said, 'Spare it. I cannot bear its frightened appearance, like an innocent going to the execution ground.' Hu He replied, 'So should we dispense with the anointing of the bell?' The king said, 'How can that be dispensed with? Exchange it for a sheep.' Mengzi continued, 'I do not know if this happened.' The king said, 'It happened.' Mengzi said, 'This heart is sufficient to become king. The commoners all thought your majesty was being stingy, but I know that your majesty simply could not bear the suffering of the ox."
Okay, thanks, Richard. Yeah, this is maybe a good time to break and sort of make sure we have sort of clearly delineated what's happened here. So Mengzi steered the conversation toward being a true king. The king is asked, what must one's virtue be like so that one can become king with a capital K, a true king? And Mengzi said, well, it's actually just about caring for the people. And once you do that, you've sort of set in process a motion that can't be stopped. And King says, well, I mean, he seems to be dubious. He seems to doubt that he himself has that capacity, that kind of care for his people. Mengzi says, in fact, you're capable of having that kind of capacity. I've heard this story about you sparing an ox. And here's the part that on the first read through or on the first listen, some of the listeners may not have caught on to. The problem is that ordinary people assumed that he swapped the sheep for the ox because he was being stingy. And the king himself doesn't seem to have questioned that interpretation. It seems like he hasn't entirely clarified in his own heart or in his own mind what it was that motivated him to spare the ox. Because, as we'll see in a little bit, he finds it very eye-opening that Mengzi has interpreted in this way. But you might wonder, why are they accusing him of being stingy? Well, the answer is because his subjects, many of them are farmers, and they understand that a sheep is much cheaper than an ox. An ox is a very valuable animal that you can use for lots of different purposes, not just meat, farm labor and that kind of thing. And so they assumed that he was too cheap to conduct the ritual as it should be conducted, and therefore wanted to save a little bit in resources. Now, in fact, that's got to be laughable because the king is so wealthy. It's like a trivial difference in value between one sheep and one ox. But the king hasn't really made that inference yet, as I understand it. He hasn't really thought it through and realized that, in fact, stinginess had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, that's a good summary. I mean, I think it's a really fascinating passage from a bunch of perspectives. One thing that's interesting at the very beginning is that Mengzi starts out by lying to the king.
Hmm.
He says, like, oh, no, there are no records passed down of one of Qi and one of Jin. Yes, there are. And in
Uh-huh.
fact, Mengzi elsewhere in the text talks about them.
Hmm.
So he's lying, but that's because these guys are, hegemons, and he wants to steer the conversation away from them. And he doesn't
Yeah.
mind strategically lying, which is interesting in itself, because if you contrast this with the view of, like, say, Immanuel Kant, for whom, being honest with people is a central moral requirement because it's part of respecting people's autonomy to make their own choices, that we're honest with them. Kant would find this reprehensible and also a very bad way to start a moral dialogue. But Mengzi, because he has this very flexible ethical view, says, well, sometimes you have to, tell a little lie
Yeah.
to serve a better purpose. And then he had this reference to virtue. And in the translation, you guys know this, we capitalize virtue when the translation of the Chinese duh. And
Yeah.
David Nivison, who was one of my teachers, wrote this really great series of articles about the evolution of the concept of duh in the Chinese tradition. And you can find them in the anthology, The Ways of Confucianism, which I edited. And the notion of virtue is it eventually comes to be a countable noun, referring to dispositions like benevolence, courage, and wisdom. So by the end of the classical period, we see it used that way. But as you were suggesting earlier, the key sense of duh or virtue with a capital V is really kind of like a moral charisma that we feel like a virtuous person has. So the way that you're kind of inspired to follow, say, Abraham Lincoln, or the way some people feel about Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King Jr., where part of the reason you want to follow them is their perceived virtue in a broad sense. That's the characteristic of somebody who has this virtue with a capital V. And Mengzi is suggesting you can get that and make people voluntarily want to follow you by showing kindness to them. And so he tells this story about the king's action. And I think you're right. The king himself is not fully resolved why he did what he did. But as we're going to see later, a key point is that, at least in Mengzi's telling of the story, the king says, I cannot bear its frightened appearance, like an innocent going to the execution ground. And I think the fact that the king conceptualizes the ox in that way, as like an innocent person going to the execution ground, is going to be important for understanding how the process of extension works.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that this phrase, it's frightened, I cannot bear its frightened appearance like an innocent going to the execution ground, keeps getting repeated, which is meant to underscore its importance for those purposes.
All right. Okay. So now let's continue to the next part of the passage. And it goes, the king said, that is so. There were indeed commoners who said that. But although Qi is a small state, how could I be stingy about one ox? It was just that I could not bear its frightened appearance, like an innocent going to the execution ground. Hence, I exchanged it for a sheep. Mengzi said, let your majesty not be surprised at the commoners taking you to be stingy. You took a small thing and exchanged it for a big thing. How could they understand it? If your majesty was pained at its being innocent and going to the execution ground, then what is there to choose between an ox and a sheep? The king laughed, saying, what was this feeling actually? It's not the case that I grudged its value and exchanged it for a sheep, but it makes sense that the commoners would say I was stingy. Mengzi said, there is no harm. What you did was just a technique for cultivating your benevolence. You saw the ox, but had not seen the sheep. Gentlemen cannot bear to see animals die if they have seen them living. If they hear their cries of suffering, they cannot bear to eat their flesh. Hence, gentlemen keep their distance from the kitchen.
Yeah, that's right. The gentlemen keep the distance from the kitchen, a famous quotable line. Very handy for the gentleman who can afford to stay away from the kitchen.
We've talked about Zhuangzi and the butcher passage, and so some have thought that
Yeah.
it's a kind of jab at this passage, perhaps. I'm not sure if we have definitive evidence for that, but that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent observation. And this is often a shocking passage, I think, for students because both the king and Mengzi are so sanguine about the fact that, well, of course, you're going to have to slaughter something. So they take for granted that the bell has to be ritually anointed with the blood of some animal. We have to have a sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And then after the sacrifice, we're going to eat the meat of the animal. It's what my old teacher, Lee Yearly, referred to as a false fixity. When you regard something as just inevitable, and so you don't consider it as something that you might do differently. But the very notion of vegetarianism or veganism, this is really an option that came to China with the arrival of Buddhism. So at this point in history, nobody's really taking seriously the possibility that maybe we just shouldn't be sacrificing animals at all.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe this is too much of an aside, but I'm sure some listeners are wondering, what is the Confucian view about animals, animal welfare? Sort of my brief account of it is as follows. They actually do think that animals do have some moral standing. They have some inherent moral considerability. It's just that it's a very low degree of moral considerability. You should be humane enough to animals that you're not going to inflict unnecessary suffering on them. But it's taken for granted that you still need to use animals for farm labor. You still need to eat the flesh of animals now and then, and you still need to sacrifice animals in order to conduct the rituals properly.
In fact, there's a passage in the Mengzi where he differentiates different levels of concern, right? So like for your parents and family, you should love them. Perhaps that's I can't remember if that's the Chinese, but
it's Qin.
Yeah.
I think it's Runmin, and Qin. Is that it?
Exactly. It's 7A45. It's a very important passage for me because I often talk about care with distinctions, love with distinctions as an important feature of Confucian thought. And so it's in 7A45, he says, Qing Qing, you love intimately your family members, you renming, you humanely love or show humane concern for the people. And then you you care for, sometimes it's is taken to be things, but it seems like he probably has in mind animals or living creatures more broadly. Yeah. If you read it in context, you'll see it's clearly meant to suggest that there are different degrees of care. So the sort of lowest degree of care is for animals. But they still do have, as I read the passage, some inherent moral standing or inherent moral considerability. That is, it's not just because we care about animals that they're entitled to some humane treatment. It's not just because they're useful to us that they're entitled to some humane treatment. Living things do have some important moral status.
Yeah, and this gets emphasized more, as we know, in the later Confucian tradition, in the Sung and Ming dynasties, and what's sometimes called Neo-Confucianism, where one of the great later Confucian sages refused to mow his lawn.
Yes.
Because, he just enjoyed watching the grass grow. I've tried that excuse, but the homeowners association.
Yeah, the Jojo Ni excuse. Yeah.
I did want to quickly note something else about this passage, which always struck me. So the king actually laughs. So I thought that's interesting, or I guess sometimes it's also it's laugh or smiled. And then he says, what was this feeling actually? I actually kind of put some weight on that laughter because I actually think he's very pleased by this observation. Like, he's like, wait a minute. For a long time, I was just maybe a piece of crap, or maybe he had a very low opinion, didn't have that much maybe even he kind of knew that he wasn't such a good person. But there's something pleasing about even this thought that, well, actually, maybe I do have something good in me. Like there's
Yeah.
some basic sense of desire for self-respect, to be thinking of oneself as a morally decent person. Yeah, I had thought that maybe this reveals something about the king, which is probably in just about all of us, that we do care to some extent, even if it's kind of been, I don't know, overridden or outweighed by other material desires, that in
Yeah.
some ways we do have this deep inside a desire for virtue, or at least to think of ourselves as good in some way. So I actually think this laughter kind of reveals that.
Yeah. So in the last episode, the one on the sprouts in the Mencius, I said that one interesting way of reading Mengzi is as this kind of astute psychologist, maybe even sort of a therapist, who calls attention to these deeper, true, or innermost desires that you may not have fully grasped, might not have been fully aware of, which are in fact better or more humane, more virtuous than you really thought. And this is one of those moments. And I like the point that you make, Richard, which is that the laughter or the smiling, probably laughter, I think is a safe inference here, is revealing of that, because laughing is something you do when something has just dawned on you. It doesn't warrant laughter. It's not humorous if it's something that you knew all along. So yeah, he seems pleased and surprised. We might say pleasantly surprised to have discovered that he has this capacity for virtue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So in that case, we'll go to the next part, and it goes as follows. The king was pleased and said, "The odes say, another person had the heart. I measured it. This describes you, master. I was the one who did it. I examined myself and sought to find my heart, but failed to understand it. But when you discussed it, my heart was moved. So, in what way does this heart accord with becoming king?"
Yeah. So 2 points about that passage. One is that it does reaffirm this interpretation that I've been pushing, which is that the king didn't fully grasp his act of mercy as one that had a kind of virtuous or moral motivation before Mengzi called his attention to it. So he quotes the odes, another person had the heart, I measured it. He's saying it describes you, Master Mengzi, Master Mencius. I myself, the king, had the heart, and you measured it. You're the one who saw its potential for virtue. He says, I examined myself and sought to find my heart, but failed to understand it, right? The other point, though, is that he says, when you discussed it, my heart was moved. So this seems to suggest that he finds himself motivated in ways that he didn't before. So Monks has actually done something to changed his psychology in some way, or his motivational set, his motivational dispositions, that in ways that weren't present in his heart beforehand. And so then he goes on to ask, in what way does this heart accord with becoming king? Now, that then leads us to the rest of the passage, and we're not going to read it all. It's quite a long passage. It's very interesting, but we only have so much time. So I'll just give you a brief summary. What happens subsequently is a long description of what is usually taken to be extension, where Mengzi says things like, treat your elders as elders and extend it to the elders of others, treat your young ones as young ones and extend to the young ones of others, suggesting that in some ways you apply these virtuous proto dispositions that you already have with respect to your own family elders and young people to those of others. So you kind of apply them outside the context of the family. And he refers to that as a kind of extension. Sometimes he calls it an extension of kindness, but it seems like he might be talking about extension more broadly construed to refer to all kinds of virtuous proto dispositions that we have in various spheres of life. And then he kind of sums it up by saying, what the ancients, meaning the ancients who were great leaders and rulers of China in the Golden Ages, exceeded at, something that they really did very well, was really nothing other than extension. They were good at extending what they did, he said. So then I will quote a little bit of the passage. Mengzi says, in the present case, you, the king, your kindness is sufficient to reach animals, but the effects do not reach the commoners. Why is this case alone different? So Mengzi makes this interesting move where he says, it seems like you seem to doubt that you have the potential to care for your people, Remember, that was sort of one of the opening questions that led to this whole digression about sparing the ox. And Mengzi's point is, if you doubt that you have the care or the capacity to care for your people, look at how far it reaches. It reaches all the way out to this other species, which is presumably a harder ethical achievement than caring for commoners. So the conclusion seems to be, in fact, you do have this capacity to be a true king, King Shen of Qi.
Yeah, we're now at the core of why this passage is so discussed and so fascinates philosophers, because it looks like what Mengzi is telling us is that there's a way to control or transform your emotional reactions. And that method of transforming he calls extension. But then the interesting question is, well, exactly how is extension supposed to work? Now, in the romantic tradition, and I'm using that capital R romantic to refer to this broad movement that reacted against Enlightenment rationalism, that people talked about the autonomy of emotions and how emotions were, not subject to rational control. And so that's one of the reasons that Kant says that we're actually not responsible for loving or even liking other people, because Kant has inherited this notion that your emotions are not within your control. And so you can't demand of people that they like others or feel respect for them or feel anything for them. You can just demand of people that they follow moral rules. So the notion that we find here that you have an element of control over your emotions is very shocking to people raised with this kind of romantic view of the emotions as not subject to rational control. And when we talk about the management of our motivations or the management of our emotions, it can sound kind of crazy or inhuman, kind of like Mr. Spock in the Star Trek universe, where you got this guy who's just trying to force himself not to have feelings, even though he's got them, by using his reason, and you feel like it's actually making him worse off, that he's trying to control his feelings instead of just having them. But it's a really intriguing idea that sometimes you can steer your emotions in a certain direction, and that this might be an important part of becoming a better person, right? So, for example, if I'm a teacher, people become teachers for different reasons, especially college professors. And some people become college professors because they just like doing research or they like thinking about abstract problems. But then an important part of our job is actually teaching young people. And sometimes, it can be frustrating. It can be very rewarding to be a teacher, but it can also be frustrating. And so for some people, you might have to learn how to like your students. I mean, I think we're all kind of blessed in the sense that, at least I know of myself, and my impression of you guys is you kind of took to this teaching pretty naturally. But, what if you have to supervise people, whether you're a manager or a teacher, and you don't feel that close to them, or you don't feel like you care for them that much? Do you just have to force yourself to do the right thing and not have the right feelings? And Mengzi is suggesting you can actually guide your feelings like you would nurture a plant, and you can't force it to happen. So you can't make it happen too fast, but you can steer your emotions in a certain way. So this wonderful phrase, treat your elders as elders and extend it to the elders of others, treat your young ones as young ones and extend it to the young ones of others, which means maybe you naturally respect or care for your own grandparents, but then if you try, you can realize that other people's grandparents are similar to yours. And if you're capable of finding what is lovable and deserving of respect in your grandparents, try to treat the grandparents of other people with the same respect by envisioning them as similar to your
Mm-hmm.
grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's children maybe that are playing outside and they're being noisy, and and your inclination is to scowl at them or even yell at them, think, well, you love your own children, or maybe you love your own nephews and nieces. These kids outside are children just like your own kids or like your nephews and nieces. And if you can see them that way, it can help extend your feeling of compassion and love and caregiving to other people's children. And so the king is being invited to do that same thing with the feeling of compassion he had for the ox, which he said was like an innocent going to the execution
Mm-hmm.
ground. But, Your Majesty, the implicit argument is your subjects are like innocents going to the execution ground. When you execute them because they're hungry, and so they end up stealing game from your royal game preserve, that's your fault if the people are hungry and they have to steal to feed themselves. Or if the people are suffering because of your exorbitant taxation to pay for your luxuries, or because of your wars of conquest, the people are suffering. See them as like innocents going to the execution ground, and your compassion will flow to them. So it's a really challenging and interesting idea.
Yeah, it's nicely put. Right. If you have the job of being a teacher and thus teacherly duties, but you don't have the temperament, there are kind of two ways of responding. One is the sort of Kantian way. A certain kind of Kantian might say, well, then I guess I just have to, go through with it, even though I'm doing it grudgingly and without much joy. And in fact, on a certain Kantian account, there's more virtue, right, in doing it grudgingly. But the other response is to say, well, then I have to find it in myself to care about my students and to enjoy this craft of this way of expressing my care and concern for people and teaching them. And so similarly for King Shen of Qi, it seems like he's basically admitting these distant subjects that he doesn't meet and never encounters. It's hard for him to find a lot of concern or compassion for them in all their predicaments. And Mengzi is pointing out to him that if you think of them as being like an innocent person being taken to the execution grounds, trembling with fear. If you see them in their predicaments, famine or, resisting invasion, what have you, just like that innocent person being taken to the execution grounds, you will elicit or begin to develop compassionate feelings for them. And if you start thinking of the elders of these other towns and communities within your borders as being like your own parents or grandparents, and their youth as being like your own children, you'll start to care about them as well. So, yeah, it's a really fascinating claim about our capacity to modify our emotional and motivational dispositions and character. I just want to mention that in the later Confucian tradition, they basically tend to break this whole passage down into two steps or two processes. I mean, there's a lot going on here, but two particular processes are highlighted. One is reflection, the other is extension. And let me try just giving a kind of rough characterization if the two of you can correct me if you think it's entirely wrong-headed. Reflection, I mean, there's a lot going on in what I'm calling reflection, but it seems to me that a key insight here, a key kind of point in reflection is just to think back on situations where you had roughly the right proto-virtuous response to a situation. And I think it's implied here that King Shen of Qi did have the right response to the ox. Once you've seen the ox in person, you've seen it suffering and trembling with fear, it's appropriate to spare it, right? So you're supposed to reflect on your own moral response to situations where they were the correct ones. And then notice what it is about the situation that elicited that response. So it wasn't just that he said, oh, spare the ox. He noticed that it resembled an innocent person being taken to the execution grounds and it was trembling in fear. That's precisely the sort of thing that we'd expect a virtuous person to notice. That's why it matters. It's not because you're trying to save the animal for some extra meat or what have you, or save some money. It was because he had compassion for this innocent creature. So that, I think, is the reflection part. And then maybe we could add reflection also involves taking some sense of joy. There are other passages in the Mengzi where he suggests you derive a sense of joy in looking back on your own virtuous or proto-virtuous responses to things. And then extension is roughly noticing how the situation where you responded correctly is relevantly similar to these other situations where you don't yet have the disposition to respond correctly. So in the case of King Xuan of Qi, he doesn't yet have the disposition to respond correctly to the suffering of his subjects, people who are suffering due to maybe his bad policies, maybe his just negligence, his lack of interest in storing up grains for the next big famine or what have you. So once he begins to see how their predicament is relevantly similar to that of the ox or relevantly similar to that of an innocent person being taken to the execution grounds, then he will begin to extend those same feelings to the appropriate objects in the relevantly similar situation. Is that right? Is that a fair characterization of those two steps?
That
That
sounds
seems
right.
like a very,
Yeah.
very good, I thought. I did want to quickly ask though
Yeah.
so Brian, I noticed that this character, si, which is the Chinese character for reflection, I think you translate it as concentration sometimes, at least in one of your books. I was going to ask you a little bit about that because those two do seem to be different concepts. There's something that they share, but why would you use the term concentration for that character?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this. And one of the most helpful passages I know about this term si, whether we want to call it concentration or reflection, is in Arthur Waley's introduction to his translation of the Analects, the sayings of Confucius and his immediate disciples, where he says, you have to think about si. It's not like a kind of Cartesian reflection where you're thinking very, very abstractly with very little connection to the outside world. It's more like a kind of longing for something or a longing attention to something which might be external, but then you're going to internalize that, and then that'll result in a further action. So the term "se" can be used, for example, to talk about a husband missing his wife. And so, when Justin is in Hong Kong and his lovely and charming wife is in San Francisco, he might "se" her, think longingly of her. But so likewise, part of what I think Mengzi thinks is involved in Si is just kind of longingly thinking about your own virtuous inclinations, which leads to a kind of strengthening of them. So, one example I sometimes use with my students is I knew someone once who was very embarrassed when he had kind or empathetic feeling for other people. And so he was a businessman and he was sometimes embarrassed about, giving to charity, or the fact that he said, oh, they really conned me. They really talked me into, caring about the kids in the orphanage. And instead of thinking like, oh, well, I don't have to be arrogant about my accomplishment, but it's a good thing about me that I care about like children who are going hungry, or I feel bad about animals that, are out in the rain and would, be happier with a, foster care, something like that.
Huckleberry Finn, when he feels that friendship toward Jim, or he cares about him, but then like the norms of society was such that, oh, you shouldn't care about him because he's black. But
Right.
Huckleberry felt a feeling toward him and he feels a little bit weird, or he's like, maybe this is wrong.
Yeah, and in Mengzi's era, you had followers of Yangju, the egoist, who were saying, well, really, in a normal person anyway, all your motivations are self-interested. There is something wrong with you if you have any other motives besides self-interest. So I think Mengzi thinks an important part of his job is just getting people to recognize they've got these moral inclinations, and it's focusing on that aspect of the role of Si that makes me sometimes translate it as just concentration. It's just kind of a longing focus on your own moral inclinations. But I think it also can have an externally directed aspect. And the term is sometimes used to describe the way someone will think about, like one of the sages is, said to, if he found something inconsistent in the behavior of other sages, he would "si" about it until he had an insight. So it suggests that this act can be external, and maybe concentration is too narrow for that use. And there is a kind of reflection, as long as we understand it as the kind of reflection where you have a very specific, concrete thing you're reflecting upon, and not just kind of navel gazing or abstractly thinking about things. But so I go back and forth. Sometimes I feel like reflection brings this out better. Sometimes I think that concentration brings it out better. And you could translate it as thinking, but again, the temptation, if you translate as thinking, is to think of it in Platonic terms, as a kind of very abstract, theoretical
analysis of a theoretical kind.
Yeah.
There is this part in 1A7, which I'm not sure if we actually read, or if Justin read it, but it has to do with weighing and measuring one's heart. So it's towards the end here, it says, weigh it. I guess in this case, I think it's the heart. And then you will distinguish the light and the heavy, measure it, and then you will distinguish the long and the short. Things are all like this. The heart, most of all, let your majesty measure it. I actually find this very intriguing and interesting. Like, what exactly is involved in measuring one's heart or weighing it? I mean, it's a very interesting way of thinking about one's heart, but it also seems connected to that idea of broader sense of reflection. I suppose maybe distinguishing the different types of emotions and desires one has, and kind of realizing what is maybe more important. Because there's also another passage where Mengzi talks about emphasizing the greater part of oneself as opposed to like the lesser part, which probably has to do with like material desires and things like power and reputation and wealth. But he thinks the virtues are like the greater part. And somehow we have this power to recognize that that is actually what is more important. So it seems like that's the sort of process by which we come to recognize in ourselves these virtuous disposition is wrapped up with this notion of reflection or and I don't have it all sort of pieced together, but I find it extremely intriguing.
Yeah, no, I do too. And there's a lot to be said about this. One thing I think is modern Westerners living in the aftermath of the scientific revolution, when people say things like weigh it, measure it, I think our go-to is to think about this in digital terms as something that you can associate with like a mathematical value. But I think when Mengzi thinks about things like weighing and measuring, he often will have in mind things that are more analog for us. So if you think in like in a traditional Chinese market, I still occasionally see these things. One of these weight sets that you use if you want to buy a particular amount of some kind of good in the market. It's not a digital scale. It's like a thing where you just kind of, you hang the weights on the scale, and then when they balance, you know you've got the right amount. And so the reason I'm stressing that is there are some views of ethics that want to make ethics almost mathematical. And I think even when he uses metaphors that might seem mathematical to us, Mengzi is thinking them in a more analog kind of way and less of a digital way. But I think you're also putting your finger on a really important aspect of Mengzi's thought, which is he thinks that reality has a kind of hierarchical structure to it. And lots of things are like this. The parts of the self, as you point out, he says there are greater parts of yourself and lesser parts of yourself. But he also says in politics, there are people who labor with their minds, and there are people who labor with their physical strength. And those who labor with their minds should rule over those who labor with their physical strength for the benefit of the other people. But there's a hierarchical structure there. And then we talked before about the fact that Zhuangzi's story of the ruler who learns how to care for life by watching a butcher carve up an ox, by actually getting in the kitchen and watching somebody slaughter an animal, might be an ironic criticism by the Taoist Zhuangzi of the Confucian Mengzi. But also the chapter in the Zhuangzi Qi Wu Lun, essay on equalizing things, might also be a long rumination on the limitations of Mengzi's tendency to want to organize everything in reality in a way that's hierarchical and where this hierarchy reflects objective kinds of values. And then just the last thing I'd say about this is, as Justin was hinting at earlier, Mengzi seems to think the fact that the king can have compassion for an animal like an ox shows that his compassion is fairly well developed. Because the idea is your compassion extends outward from family members to friends to strangers, and then only eventually to non-human animals. But your obligation is strongest to family members and then to other humans. And so in a way, the heaviest obligation, or it's a heavier obligation that you have to your subjects to care for them than the obligation you have to spare an ox. And so the king's done this thing that was actually very psychologically difficult, to see the ox as a human being led to the execution ground. And so it should be really easy, Mengzi thinks, for the king to show compassion to his subjects.
There's an interpretive issue here that doesn't often get discussed, but I've sometimes wondered about it, which is how well developed is King Xuan's sprout of benevolence or humaneness, really? So sometimes when you look at the commentaries and when you read, contemporary analyses of this passage, they suggest that King Xuan is basically discovering his sprout of humaneness or benevolence and learning to extend it. But there are two ways of understanding that sprout. One is sort of the nascent sprout, the more or less inborn sprout that's very immature, that most of us, at least those of us who had a decent upbringing, all have. The other one is to interpret it as a sprout that has already been nourished a little bit with sunlight, water, and nutrients, and is already starting to grow. It's not quite robust. It's not a mature thing by any means, but it's, we'll call it maybe an adolescent sprout or something. I have to say, I'm very tempted to read the passage as suggesting that his sprout of humaneness or benevolence is already adolescent. The point is, he's further developed than the average person. He actually does care about this ox. So I just wondered what you guys thought of that.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting observation. And I mean, we could read this passage also as a work of persuasive rhetoric. So Mengzi showing us this is how you talk to rulers in general, not just me talking to King Xuan, but this is how you get them to do what they should do. And part of that might be talking to them as if they have a more fully developed moral sense than they do, with the idea being that talking to them in that way helps them to eventually develop that more fully informed moral sense. And as you know as well, there's this other passage in book 2A2 where Mengzi gives the example of the farmer from Sung, which is probably maybe the most famous story in the Mengzi. And so the farmer from Sung is this farmer, and it's probably unfair, but the people of Sung in ancient China were supposedly really stupid.
Yeah.
So
yeah, a good rule of thumb is when you're reading a classical Chinese text, if someone introduces a farmer from Song, be prepared for someone to behave in a really foolish manner. Yeah.
Right. So they're going to be the butt of the joke. And I'm of Polish descent on my mother's side. Yeah. So I know there used to be a whole genre of politically incorrect jokes about how stupid Polish people are. And actually, in my family, we enjoyed them because we, didn't take offense at them. But if you have a joke of that genre, just substitute Sung for whatever group you're going to make fun of, and no one will be offended because there are no people who identify as people of Sung survive.
Yeah.
But so the foolish farmer from Sung was worried that his sprouts of his plants were not growing fast enough. And so he went out and pulled on them to make them grow faster. And then he went home, covered in sweat from having done this to all of his crops and bragging to his family about how he was helping the plants to grow. And I guess his son was smarter than he was, because the son thought, oh my gosh, what has dad done? And he runs out, and of course, all the plants are dead because he's uprooted them. And this is not advice about, mistakes to avoid when gardening. It's clearly a metaphor for ethical cultivation, using the plant sprouts as stand-ins for our nascent moral sense. And the point is, you can try to do too much and actually damage your moral sense. So don't start out like we see this happen where people will decide they want to be a better person, which is a good ambition, but then maybe they try to be too ambitious. And so they try to do a very challenging moral task that they fail. And so Mengzi's got this, very subtle view where he wants you to work on cultivating your moral inclinations, but he also recognizes that has to happen gradually and you can't force it to go too fast. Mm-hmm. But then when he's dealing with rulers, he seems to think that what he's asking of them is reasonable enough that even with fairly minimal moral inclinations, they can find the motivation if they try to do it. And his speaking to them aspirationally is part of getting them to the point where they have sufficiently strong sprouts that they can do the right thing, which just might mean, cutting the marginal tax rate on peasants from 70% to 50%, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I really love that passage, actually, the farmer from Song passage. Mm-hmm. It's like there's so many other cases like this, like weightlifting. If you haven't been lifting weights for years and you go out there and you start trying to deadlift, 300 pounds, you're just going to hurt yourself. Actually, it's totally counterproductive. Yeah, there's this great idea in psychology. I think sometimes it's called incrementalism, where the way to make progress is through increments or incremental progress rather than trying to do everything at once. Yeah, again, Mengzi turns out to be a very wise, astute observer of, I think, human behavior and sort of the structure of human psychology and what's sort of possible. And he's sort of working with all that, which is why I've always loved Mengzi, because you get the sense that he's really intent on and focused on figuring out how to actually make people better. And he's trying to figure out, how does that actually work in reality, given our psychological constitution?
So just sort of stepping back from the passage a little bit to talk about broader conclusions, some of the upshots. As long as I've been reading Mengzi, I've been sort of intrigued by this idea that when it comes to moral cultivation, a lot of the work that I had before reading Mengzi assumed was the core work of moral education, moral cultivation, is in fact not actually all that effective or important. And so let me kind of explain what I mean by the normal work of moral education. The normal work of moral education, I basically, at least as an undergraduate, I imagine something like an applied ethics course, where you take some hard cases, some really difficult issues in ordinary life, issues that might require you to trade your commitment to letting people be autonomous have to trade it off against some value in caring for people's well-being or welfare, or, cases like, capital punishment, lifeboat ethics. They sometimes call these scenarios, these thought experiments that they engage in ethics courses. And you try to arrive at some sort of action guiding rule or moral principle. And then you, moreover, provide some sort of justification for it, so you explain why it is that this principle is the right one. And then, of course, in a standard philosophy class, there's a lot of fine tuning of those principles because it's easy to think of exceptions, cases where you might not want to follow the rule at all. So that's one way of understanding it, basically action guiding rules or principles plus justifications. There's a kind of analogy, at least, to philosophy as we see it performed in ancient Greek texts like Plato's Dialogues, where they're trying to give an account of the nature of something like justice or piety, and then also trying to justify that account of the nature of that thing. Now, those are all really interesting. As a philosopher, that's kind of my bread and butter. I love doing that kind of reflection. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that it actually gets at the real work of moral cultivation and moral improvement. Because my view is that you can talk all day, you can talk until you're blue in the face about which rules you should abide by, which rules you should adhere to. It isn't necessarily going to motivate you very much to adhere to them, you know? And I see this again and again. For example, back in the day when I was a little bit more vigilant about prosecuting plagiarism in my classes, when someone would plagiarize, I would, confront the student because I would usually be able to find pretty definitive evidence that they had plagiarized. I'd find the source article or book that they'd drawn from, they copied from. And they invariably had all these rationalizations for their behavior. They would say, well, I found it really hard to follow you, or I felt like I was entitled to a little bit of extra help because of some family problem or health problem that I'd had or what have you, And my view is that, like, in those situations, well, my experience is that you can talk about the rules that students ought to abide by, you can justify them. They're still not going to be very motivated to do the right thing. And what's interesting about Mengzi is that he seems to recognize that that's the problem. It seems, as I understand the structure of this dialogue, 1A7, he doesn't think that there's some controversy that's supposed to be resolved here. Do you or do you not take care of your subjects when they're in great distress? Nor does he think that there's some great challenge justifying caring for one's subjects. Instead, he thinks the problem is that the king doesn't yet have the motivation to act in defense of his subjects' interests. And he's trying to get him to have that motivation. So action guiding rules, justifying them, that's all sort of beside the point. The main point is to just get him to care more about his people, to actually be motivated to protect them, to defend their interests. And that's what extension is supposed to do. And I find that when we look at specific examples of extension in the Mengzi, they're quite effective for me. So my favorite one actually is in another passage, 6A10, where Mengzi he sort of briefly entertains this idea that you could be a homeless person who is starving and therefore desperately need food to survive. And then you're supposed to imagine that someone comes along and offers you food, but offers it with contempt, spits or stomps on it, in a really disrespectful manner. So I think, the classical Chinese texts are very economical, so he doesn't fill in a lot of the details. But I picture being homeless and very, very hungry, and some rich bully comes along with his friends, and says, oh, here's this really hungry guy. Let's give him some food, but let's first spit in it or stomp on it, and then sit back with my arms folded and watch you debase yourself for me and all my friends. We can laugh at you and see how desperately hungry you are. And Mengzi assumes that there's at least some part of us which resists that kind of treatment, that would refuse the food under those circumstances. You don't want to debase yourself to entertain this rich bully, right? But then Mengzi points out, and I think this is an instance of extension, that in many ways, people who sign up to be ministers for wealthy, corrupt states debase themselves in a similar manner. So maybe they, become a minister of justice or something, and they are willing to take bribes from rich people in order to give them special political favors. And he says that happens all the time, and people quite often find that they have very little motivation to resist those bribes or those trappings of high office. And so Mengzi's suggestion, I think, is that people who are in those situations where they have a lot of political power and could be taking bribes for special political favors should start to see themselves as debasing themselves in roughly the same way that the beggar or the homeless person who is desperate for food debases him or herself for the rich bully. And for me, that's actually quite effective. I find that I'm much more motivated to resist the influences of would-be wealthy people who are trying to lure me into their nets or what have you, when I think about my responses in those terms. And notice there, it's still essentially the act of extension as I described it earlier. It's noticing relevant similarities between some situation where you already have a robust motivational response that's more or less the correct one, and some other situation where you don't really have a well-developed motivation to do the right thing. Just by seeing those similarities, you come to care more in this novel situation about doing the right thing. I think that's actually the real work of moral cultivation. It assumes that we actually, in some sense, already know, or that we don't actually have to engage in much debate about or justification, argument about the correct course of action. Quite often we do, it's relatively clear what the correct course of action is. We just have to get ourselves to do it. And it seems to me that Mengzi is in some sense keeping his eye on the real target or aim of moral cultivation here, the real problem, the real challenge in moral cultivation, which is to cultivate the emotions and motivate ourselves to do virtuous things in situations where it doesn't come so easily to us.
That's a great account, Justin. And I love that passage 6a10 about refusing a handout given with contempt too. And I like your thought experiment of thinking about it in terms of like, spoiled, upper class kids tormenting somebody that they're offering food to. I think it's a great way of thinking about it. I don't want to get too political, but I think many people would say part of the problem we have in the American political environment right now is a lot of people who basically have no sense of shame in the way that Mengzi talks about the heart or feeling of disdain to do what is shameful as the basis of the virtue of righteousness. So, how people will grovel to certain political figures in a way that you just imagine, you would be outraged if the checkout person at 7-Eleven treated you with the least bit of disrespect.
Yeah.
And it's not a weird philosophical conceit to say, why are you willing to sell yourself out like that? And like, how could anything you get as a result of this actually be worth it to you? What are you going to do when you've sold your soul, so to speak? What will be left of you after this that could be an agent that could do anything important? Mengzi has got this great line, there have to be some things you won't do, or you can't really do anything. And I think that's a lot of people in contemporary political environments could learn from that.
Yeah.
The other thing to note, though, is I guess Mengzi would say, well, yeah, these people who are groveling toward certain political figures, it's not so much that like they don't have any sense of shame at all anymore. It's more that they just haven't realized that the whatever sense of shame that they probably still have to some extent in some way, they're failing to recognize that they're doing certain actions that are, even by their lights, would be considered shameful, but they're not looking at it from that point of view. They need to recast, reimagine, reframe what they're doing by tapping into the resources of whatever basic inclinations of disdain that they actually possess, unless it's really been uprooted, which I've wondered if to what extent Mengzi thinks it could be totally obliterated. But I've always liked Mengzi because he's looking to tap into whatever is still there working inside the person, like in the King case. And then he says, well, the process of extension is where you're able to also look at things from a different angle, using some of those basic tendencies or inclinations you already have, which makes it a very psychologically plausible way of moving forward. Yeah, anyways, Justin, yeah, that was great. And I totally agree that just going through hard cases like the trolley problem probably doesn't make you any better of a person. And in fact, I've worried that what smart students learn in sometimes ethics classes is they just learn how to rationalize better. Like they're like, oh, this is great. Philosophy is amazing. Now I can tweak my principles. And then of course, we have certain self-centered tendencies too. And it's so easy to rationalize. And especially if you're kind of more sharper in that regard, and it doesn't help you from an ethical point of view. So I've worried about ethics classes, in fact, making some students even worse.
I think that's a great point. I mentioned Lee Yearly before, and he had this concern as well. And in particular, I hope this doesn't take us too far afield, but Yearly was concerned is a kind of casual ethical skepticism or a kind of casual ethical relativism. If you encourage that in your students, do you end up just helping to produce the next generation of senators and Supreme Court justices and doctors and other professionals who just learned, well, I can rationalize anything, and after all, who's to say? That's what, Pontius Pilate literally said, before condemning Jesus, says, well, what is the truth? The dogmatic confidence in your beliefs can be dangerous, But on the other hand, in times when we sometimes are going to be called upon to take heroic stands against evil, it's good sometimes to have a lot of confidence in the importance of benevolence or compassion for other people. And it's good to have a lot of very strong commitment that there's certain things I just won't do, because what kind of horrible human would do something like that? That's not who I am.
Right. Yeah, that's a really nice point. So I was, in some ways, my original formulation of what's distinctively good about Mengzi's model of moral cultivation vis-a-vis what I called the sort of typical understanding of moral education, classroom model where you learn action guiding rules or principles and justify them. I just said, well, the problem is that learning action guiding rules and justifying them isn't actually efficacious. You are both pressing this other idea that, in fact, it could make things worse because it could make you a very good rationalizer so that you're even better at rationalizing things, which really should be obviously wrong and should violate fundamental sort of moral prohibitions that you should be adhering to. Mengzi seems more alert to that fact. His model of moral cultivation is really meant to address the real problem there. Well, this has been great. Really interesting stuff. Well, so we've covered so much ground here, and I really feel like we could continue for hours. There's so much more to say, but alas, we should probably wrap it up. And thank you so much, Brian. This has been a great discussion. We do have some customs, some traditions with our guests, and one of them is to ask some standard questions. One question I want to try out, just in case you happen to have a ready answer to it, has to do with this idea that there are takeaways, there are lessons or insights from the Chinese text that you study that you really think are well worth other people taking into account and applying to their own lives. And so, yeah, the question is essentially, is there some one idea, insight, or suggestion that you would recommend to others that comes out of the Chinese tradition as you understand it?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, actually, I think so. One thing that often strikes me, especially when I read Confucian texts, is we normally think that it's possible to get better at a lot of things. So if you want to learn to play the guitar, we think, well, you can learn to play the guitar and you can get better at playing the guitar. Or if you want to play tennis, you could take lessons and you could get better at playing tennis. Or you could get better at appreciating fine wine. You could become a wine connoisseur. So there's all these things you can get better at. But I think in our contemporary society, we tend to assume you can't get better at being a human being. And I think part of the challenge of the Confucian tradition is they say, you know what? You can get better at being a human being. And Mengzi says an important part of that is thinking about what your own moral responses are and asking yourself, are there other cases where I should be as benevolent as I am to my own grandparents, to this older person I've encountered on the bus who, maybe needs, a seat that I could give up to them? Or is the sense of shame that makes me bristle, when I'm, treated rudely by, someone on the street, is that something which I should also be manifesting when I'm asked to do something immoral or inappropriate by a supervisor or even a coworker at work? And that could be the part of what it is to get better at, being a human being.
Yeah. Okay, good. So reflection extension, in a way, is the takeaway. First of all, Mengzi seems to suggest quite clearly that self-cultivation, moral cultivation, becoming a better human being is a lifelong enterprise. There is this view, you're right, in modern life that in some sense, once you're a kind of fully formed adult, the cake is baked, right? There's nothing more you can do. Your character is set. And the Confucians emphatically reject that. It's a lifelong project, according to the so-called spiritual autobiography of Confucius. It's not until he's 70 that he's really finished. So that's one insight. And then the other insight that you're suggesting we take away is just that how you do it. You do it by looking for ways of leveraging the good responses you already have in various situations. including that sense of integrity or kind of refusal to debase yourself that you encounter in your ordinary life. That's great. Yes. So well worth continuing to reflect on and applying to our own lives. Well, with that, I think we have to say this episode is a wrap. Then I guess we'll say that was the way for today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Brian.
Bye, everyone.